Hi, this is Keith Wasson, and this presentation is entitled Natural Immunity versus Synthetic Immunity. One of the cornerstones of good health is a properly functioning immune system. One of the fastest growing fields of publishing are work centered around the immune system. If you visit a major bookstore, just go over to the health section and you'll see a large number of books devoted to performance of the human immune system. There's been a major shift in the public consciousness regarding immune health in the last 10 or 15 years, in that people are starting to see that having good immune health is more about strengthening and boosting the inner workings of their immune system as opposed to trying to avoid germs or avoid disease. In fact, if you Google immune system boost, you're going to find about 8 million hits. So people are definitely interested in reading about how to improve their immune system. Well, one of the issues that has driven this interest in immune system research has been vaccines and vaccination policies and practices. At one time, it was almost considered taboo to even question the practice of vaccination. But a growing number of researchers and authorities are beginning to take a hard, long look at this long-established practice. There's a growing number of families who have decided to exempt their children from all mandatory vaccines so their children can get in schools. And this debate tends to focus largely on the adverse reactions associated with vaccines, as well as the vaccines contributing to certain health conditions. And though those are important issues, I believe they're secondary in nature. The primary issue is this: can it be demonstrated that artificial or synthetic immunity is superior to natural immunity? Well, that's where our focus should be, because if synthetic immunity is demonstrably better than natural immunity, the rest of the debate is just a risk-benefit issue. So this presentation is not going to bash vaccines or question the practices of vaccine manufacturers, but we're going to attempt to answer the question, what is the optimal way for a human being to acquire immunity? The practice of vaccination goes back thousands of years, all the way back to the Far East and China, maybe even into ancient Egypt. There's been crude artifacts recovered in ancient Egyptian tombs that show very crude devices used to inoculate or administer vaccines. The practice of modern vaccine began in 1796 with a guy by the name of Edward Jenner. Jenner had observed that milkmaids, those young ladies who milked cows for a living, rarely, if ever, were stricken with smallpox. Now, in today's terms, smallpox was as deadly as heart disease or cancer. It was a very scary thing back in those times. It killed anywhere between 10 to 20% of the people who acquired it, and those who survived were often left with lifelong lasting trauma, debilitating conditions, as well as terrible scars throughout their whole body and their face. In fact, Edward Jenner called smallpox the speckled monster because it almost left people disfigured. Well, he had observed, again, that these milkmaids rarely got smallpox. And the theory was that they had acquired what's called cowpox from coming into contact with the udders or the teats of the cow. And so he theorized that it was the cowpox which strengthened their immune system against the smallpox. And in 1796, Edward Jenner injected an 8-year-old boy by the name of James Phipps with lymph material made from cowpox. He waited about 6 weeks, and then he injected him with smallpox right into the bloodstream. And the young boy survived. In fact, follow-up shots showed no adverse reactions other than being in bed and having some fevers. But the boy, according to natural conditions, did not acquire smallpox. And based on that alone, Jenner said, I have found the cure for smallpox. And on a side issue, he began injecting other kids, including his own son. This young boy that you see in the picture here did die at age 20 of tuberculosis. So based on this one experiment, with no follow-up, no studies, no controlled laboratories, the practice of vaccination began to grow throughout England. At first, a lot of the doctors were opposed to smallpox vaccination. They thought it went against nature, but there was a public outcry for it. It was an epidemic at the time, and so slowly over the years, more and more doctors began to administer vaccines. This resulted in a lot more deaths directly from smallpox. In fact, in many of the populated places in England, there was literally bodies in the street. Now, this kind of worried the doctors of their time. They feared public backlash. They didn't want to be blamed. So they went to those in charge. They went to the king and said, look, we've been vaccinating these people against smallpox, and a lot of them have lived. Therefore, that proves that smallpox vaccine works. But we know there's more deaths now, but that's because these people didn't get vaccinated soon enough. And they even attempted to blame it on the people who either hadn't been vaccinated or those who refused to be vaccinated, kind of like the same thing that happens now today. And the king said, well, what we're going to have to do is, number one, we're going to exempt you from any kind of liability for the deaths of these people, and we're going to mandate vaccines. And that was the first time the government actually got involved and said, we will vaccinate everybody. You can see here from this chart that vaccine deaths were already declining before vaccine laws were mandated and enforced. And in the years that following, there was a sharp spike, a sharp skyrocket in the number of deaths, and then gradually they fell off, which is normal with a natural cycle of disease. If you were to look at the graph of any mass vaccination campaign in history, it looks very similar to this, where the incidence of the death is already on the decline. They introduce the mass campaigns, more and more people get vaccinated, death rates go up, and then they tend to fall off. Now, the theory behind immunization or vaccination is fairly straightforward. The theory is, if we can artificially inject, if we can artificially duplicate natural immunity by using a dead or controlled attenuated form of the toxin, we can induce natural immunity in the body in a way that's better than natural immunity. But you notice, you can look this up in any medical dictionary, any medical book on disease or immunology, and it's going to have a definition, something like this. But notice at the end, it says this process allegedly creates artificial immunity. Supposedly, in theory, it's never definitive. It's still a theory. You look at this chart, it says the same thing. We inject a weakened form of the antigen into the body. The body reacts to the antigen by creating antibodies. And when this happens, the body is then immune against that antigen for life. My question is, does this really happen? Can it be demonstrated this is exactly how the vaccine works? So, there's two questions to ask. Number one, does this vaccine make you immune? And number two, how does it do it? Do vaccines reduce the statistical evidence of disease? And the answer is yes, absolutely they do. Every time they have inoculated people in mass campaigns, the statistical incidence of disease always goes down. I don't dispute that. That's undisputable. That's what they tend to base their effectiveness results on. The bigger question is, how do they accomplish that? How do they get those rates to go down over the short term? Two questions. Do vaccines strengthen the immune system? There's a number of tests, laboratory tests, that you can measure immune competence. And it would be very easy to demonstrate that a vaccine actually strengthens the inner working of the immune system. However, none of those tests have ever been done. Virtually all studies of effectiveness of vaccines are based on statistical data and the presence or absence of disease or the symptoms associated with disease. There's never been any medical studies that have been performed that demonstrate that vaccines increase the immune system competence of the human body. And this would be very easy to do. There's, again, a number of laboratory tests where you can measure immune competence before and after. To give you an example, If you had a lot of bills coming in, you were in a lot of debt, and you wanted to resolve this debt, um, you could get rid of your mailbox. You could just destroy your mailbox, and then the bills would no longer come in. You say, I don't have any bills coming in. Well, you would say, but the bills are going to find their way one way or the other. They're going to start coming to your house. They're going to start calling you. And therein lies the problem. It's only a short-term solution. You're only statistically reducing the bills for a short period of time. Same is true of someone who needs money, and they go out and cash advance their credit card. It seems like they have more money over the short term, but they're actually deeper in debt. Vaccines appear to reduce clinical evidence of disease, not by strengthening the immune system, not by strengthening immune competence, but by actually weakening it, by altering the way natural immunity occurs. They reduce the incidence of disease by lowering the threshold and vitality of the immune system. Now, why is that? How did we get to a point where we measure the immune system based on whether there's symptoms or not, as opposed to measuring immune competence? Well, you have to go back and look at the history of immune system research. We've been engaged in vaccinations in one form or the other for maybe as much as 2,000 years, yet the history of the study of the workings of the immune system and immune system research are relatively recent. Now, the Journal of Immunology claims to have been around since 1915. I cannot find a single copy that was printed prior to about 1958. I've checked with museums and libraries and archives. I've called their office, and again, if they exist, we've just not been able to find them. And so the studying the immune system, we've only been doing it for maybe 50 years at the most, and even then, a lot of that has been very crude research. The challenge with immunology research is, where does the immune system fit in? At one time, immunology was lumped in with cancer research, with the oncologist. At other times, it was lumped in with allergists. It really didn't become a specialty of its own until fairly recently. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not like the lungs or the heart, where it's one system. It's easy to look at. It's easy to examine and look at cadavers. The immune system is all over the body. It's small. You didn't have the technology with electron microscopes to be able to look at the tiny workings of the molecules and the white blood cells. And even the British Medical Journal here says the biggest issue is the question of, what does an immunologist do? It is sometimes seen as a mechanism-based specialty and as an emerging specialty, but it doesn't feature in national health priorities. Immunology is everywhere, but it is seen as nowhere due to lack of specific procedures that belong to the specialty. And this has always been a challenge for the field of immunology. The electron microscope was invented in 1931. It saw a lot of use during World War II, the various countries using it as part of their mobile units and their medical units, but really became widespread use, particularly in research and at the university academic level, in the late 50s into the 60s. This is when you started seeing more immunology research merging, because primarily of the electron microscope. And you saw more and more publishing, you saw more and more textbooks being devoted to the workings of the immune system. However, most of it was incorrect. The prevailing thought of the day was that the immune system acted completely independent of the nervous system. Because you couldn't see a physical connection between, say, white blood cells and the spinal nerves of the brain, researchers of the day thought the immune system was completely independent. It acted on its own accord. And you see this in literature, in textbooks, all the way up as late as the late 1970s, even into the early 1980s. Medical textbooks said the immune system acted independently of the central nervous system. Immune system research changed in a very big way in the 1980s with the AIDS HIV crisis. All of a sudden, you had global research institutions studying the immune system from a functional standpoint, not from a disease or the effects of the immunology, but rather as one complete functional unit, how it operated, how it integrated with the other systems. And it completely changed virtually everything we know about how the immune system works. "97% of our present immune system research knowledge has come in the last 25 years. The 1990s was known as the decade of the brain because so much money, so much resources were devoted to studying the inner workings of the brain and the central nervous system. And what they found time and time again was you could not separate the nervous system and the immune system. And it changed how we think of the interaction between the brain and the immune system. In fact, it changed how we looked at health and disease to begin with. And this prompted many researchers and authors and journalists to begin writing about a new way of looking at health, a new way of looking at disease. Newsweek writes, "Pressed by patients and advancing technology, healthcare will soon change its focus from treatment to enhancement, from repair to improvement, from diminished sickness to increased performance. The transformation has already begun. Accompanying this will be on increased emphasis on psychoimmunology, the science that deals with the mind's role in helping the immune system fight disease, which will become a vitally important clinical field, perhaps the most important field in the 21st century." So this information that they'd learned from AIDS research and from the decade of the brain research began influencing all areas of healthcare. And modern healthcare didn't come out and say, well, we were wrong for all those years when we said that the immune system was independent of the nervous system, but they just sort of used language that said we've discovered new things. For example, the Lancet says, "The focus of science has shifted from separate entities of the immune system to an interactive immunology model. In the neural immune concept, the brain has specific two pathways to the immune system." And within a few very short years, all of the textbooks begin talking about the neuroimmune system connection. For example, this is a standard human anatomy and physiology textbook. It says the nervous system plays an important role in both the control and activity of the immune response. The sheer power of the brain to affect the body as a whole and general state of health is amazing. Folks, you didn't see any book that talked about this in terms of a standard anatomy and physiology book prior to the 1980s. The other thing we've learned over the last couple of decades is how the immune system develops at a very early age. When a baby's born, they have an immune system, but it's not developed. It's dormant, very much like their reproductive organs. They're there, but they don't come into play until puberty. But when a baby's born, they have that immune system, but they're completely dependent on their mother, the mother's breast milk, for their antigens, for their immunity. And as the baby slowly begins developing their immunities, the breast milk, which is biologically specific to that child, will change as well. They've done studies where a little baby will have a virus or have some sort of an illness, and the mother begins nursing, and the breast milk will actually change in order to make the exact antigens needed to assist that child. And that's pretty amazing if you think about it. Follow-up studies show that the mother only had to be in the same room. Within 7 seconds, the breast milk would change to make up the exact antigens, biologically specific material, in order to combat that illness. On average, a typical child would begin crawling around 6 months of age. What also happens at this time is that when their immune system begins rapidly developing. See, what happens is they're invoking a little cross-crawl motion. kind of like a swimmer going across the floor. And the postural action of the muscles along their spine will actually fire nerve messages into those major immune system organs, bringing them to life, bringing them to increased development. If a child is a late crawler, 8 or 9 months, maybe because they were premature, they're not quite strong enough, guess what? The immune system deliberately holds back on the development, waiting for it to be strengthened via the nervous system. Also, as infants begin crawling around, widening their perimeter, what do they do with everything they get their hands on? They put it in their mouth. Why? They're deliberately exposing their tiny developing immune system to all these little antigens in order for their rapidly developing immune system to mount a response. So it's the body's way of further developing the immune system naturally. As the child is exposed to these antigens, as their immune system is developing, they develop symptoms. They get sick. Well, guess what? Every bit of the research that we found over the last, again, 25 years shows that a great deal of the normal childhood illnesses, not only are they normal, not only are they natural, they're downright beneficial because the immune system develops in combat. The symptoms associated with those illnesses are all part of how the body strengthens, how the immune system nervous system connection strengthens, is enhanced, how the connection and signaling in the body is enhanced and developed. The Center for Biological Signaling Studies is a collection of research institutions over in Germany that has undertaken a very extensive research project to show just how critical signaling is in the human body, and why not just signaling needs to be developed, but it has to be developed just the right time. So in other words, the proper sequence of these signaling events, as in the case of immune system development, is critical to the long-term health of that individual. This idea of signaling has caught on with many different research projects and a lot of modern healthcare thinking. Scientific American says no one could survive without precise signaling in cells. The body functions properly only because the cells constantly communicate with each other. And this is a product of how well those signaling mechanisms are developed the first year in life with proper immune system development. And so now we look at infection and we look at childhood disease a little bit differently. We always thought of those symptoms as being the bad thing, the thing to eliminate. Well, with everything we know about immune system development, we now look at symptoms as being part of or direct result of the normal natural healing process. Archive of Childhood Disease has said infection during the first year of life may have a protective effect by modifying the lympholytic response to subsequent immunological challenges. A link with decreasing early exposure to common infectious disease could account for the increased risk of diabetes over the past 30 years. And what they're saying is, when you try to override proper immune system development early in life, you end up changing the signaling mechanism. When you don't have as much infection, you actually weaken the person for later and expose them to health problems later on in life. When you try to mask or alter the healing physiology of the body, you alter the communication pathways. In the words of the warden in Cool Hand Luke, what we have here is a failure to communicate. And again, when you try to alter those natural developmental cycles, when you alter natural sequential signaling, you're going to end up with far worse problems. Newsweek said, with the rise of vaccine and antibiotics, people in developed countries have experienced fewer serious childhood infections than ever before, and scientists suspect that an immune system with no serious work to do is likely to become a renegade army. attacking whatever irritants it encounters. And this is why we see the rise in autoimmune diseases and allergies. Boy, 20, 30 years ago, you might have one child in a classroom that had allergies. Now you go into a typical classroom, it's surprising to find one who doesn't have a plethora of allergies. And it's not difficult to look around and see how this has affected our lifestyle, our country, and people around the world. Now, with so many kids allergic to so many things, everywhere you go, you see these warning signs. Don't bring peanuts in here. Don't bring any kind of peanuts or snack food because so many kids are allergic to them because their immune systems were never properly developed early in life. One of the primary reasons. This article from The Economist pretty much sums up what we've been talking about the last 5 or 10 minutes. It says the control or even eradication of childhood disease has been heralded as one of medicine's finest accomplishments. Yet, there's a growing suspicion that infection intervention may have an adverse effect on the patients. As childhood infections have decreased, chronic afflictions have now increased. Meaning, instead of the kid being sick, symptomatic for 2 weeks as their immune system was being strengthened, they've traded that for lifelong problems in adulthood. From Science News, several studies have shown that the incidence of asthma and allergies tends to rise in countries where childhood immunization rates are high. This has prompted researchers to suggest that certain infections may trigger immune changes that protect children from developing asthma and allergies later. Preliminary studies have shown a protective effect of measles and infections with intestinal parasites. We're seeing this over and over and over. When the child goes through those immune changes early in life, they're protected against things like cancer and diabetes because their signaling pathways have been properly developed. If you open up any sort of anatomy or physiology textbook and look up immune system organs, you're going to see a chart very similar to this showing the major organs of the immune system. And then further in the textbook, you're going to see a chart that looks something like this that shows the specific elements of the immune system, the B cells, the T cells, the memory cells, the nonspecific killers. What's interesting is the majority of textbooks and the majority of research is devoted to what we call specific immunity. The T cells, the B cells. That's where most of the research dollars, that's where most of the funding goes. But there's a big problem with focusing far too much attention on just the specific element of the immune system. The problem with focusing too much attention on the specific defenses is they are a very small, very highly specialized form of defenses, and they compromise a very small part of the immune system. There's actually 3 lines of defenses that the body uses. You can sort of think of this as a castle back in the old medieval days, and there's this big, huge wall around the castle. You know, it's 20 feet high, it's guarded by hundreds or maybe even thousands of soldiers. And as you get in further, the walls get a little bit higher, they get a little bit thicker, and there's less soldiers, but they're more highly trained soldiers. And so the closer you get to the castle, the closer you get to the keep or the king, the thicker the barriers come and the more specialized the bodyguards and the personal soldiers. Well, your first line of defense is the skin, the mucus, the membranes. Do you realize that every opening in the body, every orifice, is just packed with mucus that's just loaded with non-specific immunoglobulins that can combat antigens all day long? And your skin is this incredible defense mechanism. Even the hairs and the follicles that make up the skin, those are all part of traps and filters that prevent disease. Well, if something makes it through, the first line of defense, they get into the second line of defense. The phagocytes, the complements, the interferon, the inflammation, the fever. This is the real workhorse of the immune system. These are the guys that get in, and this is all non-specific. These are not part of the specific defense. But if something has breached the skin, if something has gotten past the mucous lining, then these guys go after it and they attack it. This is the real workhorse. And you see, this is where health is. Health is in lines 1 and 2. Your nutrition, your hygiene, good food, good exercise, keeping your frame intact, keeping your nervous system functioning. That's where the majority of the immune system strength needs to come from. And you see, if they get all the way down into the specific defenses, if they've breached 1 and 2, you have some very highly specialized cells, the T cells, the B cells, and the memory cells, that can go to work combating any kind of antigen that could have gotten past through all of those barriers. In the 1980s, as part of the AIDS research, a lot of which took place in France, the research team at the Pasteur Institute in Paris showed that at least 98%, it's actually higher than that, of the immune response comes from non-specific immune system defenses, as we just described. And folks, vaccination doesn't do a thing to improve non-specific defenses, other than weaken it. Let's say you have a mall cop, a traffic cop, and a highly specialized member of a SWAT team. You would not have your SWAT guy directing traffic or writing parking tickets. You wouldn't use those resources for anything other than highly specialized activities. And folks, what happens is when vaccines are administered directly into the blood, when they bypass the skin, when they bypass the fluids of the body and they go right into the blood, then what happens is you use up a lot of those highly specialized T cells and B cells. They get exhausted, and so they can no longer mount an effective response, which weakens the immune system in the long run. And it gets back to what we said. It's one of the ways that disease rates, incidence of disease, can go down, because the immune system is no longer mounting a response, because so much of the specialized form has been exhausted handling the vaccine. Remember this chart we looked at earlier on how a vaccine works? How a vaccine theoretically creates immunity? Well, I think you now know that it does not strengthen the immune system. It actually weakens it. Let me show you exactly how a vaccine appears to work or create an effect. Here's how vaccines actually work or appear to work. That is, they are able to reduce statistically the presence of the symptoms associated with the disease. Number one, the data is heavily manipulated in how the reporting of the various diseases occur. I don't want to make this sound like a conspiracy theory, but it always works out this way. In 1954, prior to mass polio vaccination campaigns, you had to have the symptoms that were associated with polio for 24 hours in order to be deemed a polio victim. And those symptoms were headache, body aches, fever, stomach ache. No lab diagnosis, no lab confirmation. Those symptoms would count as incidents of polio. You were a polio statistic. Prior to, or after rather, 1955, after the campaigns began, you then had to have the symptoms associated with polio for 60 days in order to be counted. So you can see that would dramatically reduce the number of people counted as polio. And again, no laboratory confirmation, just the symptoms associated. And this is true in all mass modern inoculation campaigns. The data is changed in order to produce a favorable outcome. The big one is vaccines bypass that normal biological process, especially in the early years, especially in the years where the immune system is developing. This reduces that whole signaling and communication process. This impairs or limits the effectiveness of the nonspecific immune response, meaning you have less symptoms. And as we said earlier, symptoms are part of or a result of the healing process. It's how your body reacts to a specific problem. By overriding those communication circuits, you can tone down, you can numb, you can diminish the effectiveness of the immune response, less symptoms, less statistical disease. And the last way is vaccines impair cytokine function. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide. Cytokines are these low-weight proteins which are found throughout the body, and their primary job is coordination. They're what coordinate the efforts of the nervous system, the immune system. They also coordinate cellular signaling, cell-to-cell signaling between the respiratory system, between digestive system, because this entire body has to function as one unit. You know, think about an orchestra or a symphony. It's not enough for the clarinet player to play his or her piece just perfectly. They got to do it in the exact right timing and tempo with all the other 100 musicians in that orchestra. And so it's the cytokines which coordinate the timing, the specific timing of all these events. And of course, vaccines just destroy the cytokines. Cytokine destruction, communication is lessened, the ability to signal, the ability to coordinate is lessened, less of an immune response, less symptoms, lower incidence of statistical disease. Well, I hope you're beginning to see that it's not even a matter of whether synthetic or artificial immunity is equal to or better than natural immunity. You can't even compare the two because there really is no immunity gained artificially or synthetically. It's not even, they don't even claim to do it. You know, if you look at the warning inserts at a lot of the major vaccine manufacturers, and by the way, most of the time you don't see those warning inserts. You go into the health department or you go into the doctor's office and people get their shots. They don't see what's in the box. But even in their own warning inserts, they don't claim to make you immune. Connaught Laboratory says the practice of DPT vaccination has played a major role in reducing the incidence rates of cases from each of those diseases. Nothing about immunity. U.S. Pharmacopoeia. It is true that natural infection almost always causes better immunity than vaccines. Imagine that. Whereas immunity from disease often follows a single natural infection, immunity from vaccines can occur only after several doses. And this is why they always need booster shots. They're really not making you immune. It's just you have to continue to weaken the immune system over and over again. Center for Biological Laboratory says one problem with inactivated influenza vaccine is the immunity generated is only partial. And Event Immunotherapeutic says the antigen contained in many injectable vaccines will not produce an immune response sufficient enough to confer protection against infection. Of the 23 vaccines currently in routine use, 20 are delivered by injection and stimulate only systemic, meaning local, immunity, if at all. So with everything that we know in immunology research and what we learned, why do we continue to vaccinate? I mean, there's more vaccinations given now than ever before. If we can prove that natural immunity is superior to artificial immunity, why does there continue to be this big push for vaccines? And you know, you can draw your own conclusions, folks, but I believe it really comes down to money and power. This is from the Medical Sentinel. The Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices is a group of individuals handpicked by the CDC. They recommend which vaccines are administered to American children. Working mainly in secret, ACIP members frequently have financial links to vaccine manufacturers. Dependent on CDC funding, state vaccination programs follow CDC directives by influencing state legislatures to mandate new vaccines. Federal vaccine funds can be denied to states which do not vigorously enforce mandatory vaccination laws. Conversely, the CDC offers financial bounties to state health departments for each fully vaccinated child. There's an incredible amount of money in this. And think about it. Most of the vaccines are paid for by taxpayers. So think about it. The government can at least attempt to compel you to get vaccinated. They make you pay for it, and the vaccine manufacturers are, by and large, exempt from any sort of legal liabilities, just as they were back in Edward Jenner's day. So I think you can see here that it's almost a no-brainer on which form of immunity is superior. You can't even really compare the two. Natural immunity is always the best way to go, and working to improve the health and function of the human body. Good nutrition, good neurological function, good posture, good nutrition, good exercise, always are going to be superior to trying to combat germs and disease. I appreciate you listening tonight. We'll now take any questions.